we're going to continue working through our series in the book of Ecclesiastes. If you would turn with me, if you haven't already, we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 10 this evening. And just another quick recap for us for the book. So what we've seen at the very beginning is we're introduced to the words of the preacher. We're told that the book is written by this individual called the preacher. And does anyone remember what the Hebrew word is for the preacher in the book? So the Hebrew word for the preacher is koheleth, and what that word simply means is the one who addresses the assembly. Now, when we look to the Greek, there's a common word that is used for assembly or church, and many of you probably know this. This is ecclesia. Iglesia is, I believe, Spanish. Ecclesia is the Greek version for the word church or assembly or gathering. And so when we come to the book of Ecclesiastes, that's moving from that word ecclesia, which is rooted in the word the preacher or koheleth, who is addressing the assembly. So that's essentially what Ecclesiastes is coming from. So these are the words of this individual who's addressing the assembly. Well, what is he telling them, or what is his purpose in writing? Well, what we find is that he immediately goes into this explanation that all of life is vanity. He says, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And does anyone remember what the Hebrew word is there for vanity, or your translation might say meaningless? Hevel, right? And so hevel, what that simply means, it's like if you could imagine vapor or smoke, right? You can see vapor or smoke, right? It's literally there, but you know that it's going to be gone very quickly. It's like a breath, right? It's here for a moment and then it's gone the next. And though you can see it, if you were to try to grasp onto it or hold onto it, it would be futile, right? You couldn't actually hold on to these things. And so what this writer is discussing here is he's saying that life, like smoke or like vapor, it's brief. You can't really hold on to it, so it's elusive. And then he also goes into some other details explaining how it's even kind of cyclical. And so because of this fact, he starts to ask the question, well, what does it profit us in all of our work? And basically what he's saying is, so what is the meaning of life? That's really the question, and I think that's a question probably all of us have asked sometime in our lives. What is the meaning of life? What is the purpose for our existence? And can we find any true satisfaction or fulfillment? That's what he means by, is there any profit? Is there any lasting significance to what we would do here under the sun? And so, to answer this question, the preacher goes on many different quests, right? Different pursuits to see if he can find the answer to these very deep questions to life's mysteries. And so, we see that he went on the pursuit for wisdom, which many of us would probably think that would be the good selection, right? To pursue wisdom. And so, he pursues wisdom, and after he's accrued all of the worldly wisdom that he can, he says that with the increased amount of wisdom also came the increased amount of grief or vexation in his life. So he didn't find satisfaction or fulfillment in even wisdom. So then he decided to go after pleasures, go after wealth, go after riches, go after popularity, and so on. He goes off go after all of these different things, and ultimately he keeps repeating the same phrase, that all of it is vanity, and it's like chasing after the wind. It's futile. It doesn't have any lasting significance. And so, after we've seen a lot of these different pursuits, what we've been seeing in the last few chapters that we've been working through is, so what he started to do is start to lead us to hopefully recognize that we're not going to find satisfaction under the sun in these fleeting, temporary, material things. Rather, he's hoping that he will prepare us to receive the teaching, which is to fear the Lord. That he's leading us to have a reverential relationship with God. But before he gets to that complete conclusion in chapter 12, which if you can notice, after us been working through many weeks of this, and he's leading us there, we're at the home stretch now, because as we're approaching chapter 10. But the last couple of chapters, what we've seen is he's started to just give us some practical wisdom before he gives us the ultimate thing, which is the greatest amount of wisdom, which is the fear of the Lord. And so he's been giving us just some advice on the day-to-day things, and he explains the benefits or the advantages of wisdom, right? Basically, if you do wise things, then usually good things will follow. Now, he obviously shows not always. We can't always, expect wisdom to save the day, but in many cases, wisdom can really be beneficial for us. So he gives us the benefits as well as the limitations of wisdom. And so we've been seeing him explain these different things, and then in chapter 9, we see that he goes on to explain a few more things, and he tells us how there are some uncertainties in life, even with our wisdom, but he still tells us to enjoy life. And that's kind of the last thing that we really focused in on last time, is some of the practical wisdom he gave, is recognize that though our wisdom is good, it has limitations, but even when we are in those moments of limitations or uncertainty, enjoy life. Try to be present in the moments and recognize all of these things that we've received in this life are gifts from God. So that's where we've kind of been thus far in the book. Now, as we approach chapter 10, it's going to kind of continue the same thought process of talking about wisdom, right? Because Ecclesiastes is a part of the wisdom literature, so that's going to be still very, very important here. But rather than thinking of it as just regular wisdom to apply, kind of think of it on the flip side. So if you think of the last couple of weeks as encouraging you to pursue wisdom, think of this as a warning to flee from foolishness, or as the text will say, folly. So this is going to be a warning to avoid folly and to recognize the power and impact that it will have in our lives. And I think actually as you will read this and as we think about these things, we'll notice that folly or foolishness is really prevalent throughout our entire lives. Well, you'll see it in your schools. You'll see it at your workplace. You'll see it in your government. You'll see it, sadly, even in your churches. You will see it in your homes. But ultimately, I think what Ecclesiastes is going to be getting at here is you're going to see it in yourself. You're going to see the folly or the foolishness within your own life, your own words, actions, thoughts, all of these things that we do day to day. I think it's going to challenge us and explain that we can't allow the folly of our own lives to be impacting and affecting all of these different areas of our lives. So what we're going to do is we're going to read chapter 10, and what you'll notice is, unlike many of the other chapters, usually he kind of has like a progressive argument or that case that he's making here. And though it ultimately is still pointing to the fact that we are to avoid folly, you're going to notice a lot of them are kind of disjointed, and they're kind of different thoughts here and there. And so don't think of this as he's just, chronologically making an argument here with premise, conclusion. Rather, think of it as he's giving you just different stories, proverbs, maxims, exhortations, basically, to encourage this one thought process, which is to avoid folly and to pursue wisdom. Okay, so with that being said, let's read chapter 10 together. It says, "Dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. If the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, as an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. If the axe is dull, and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles, and your princes feast at the proper time. For strength and not for drunkenness. Because of laziness the building decays, and through idleness of hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Do not curse the king, even in your thought. Do not curse the rich, even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. So as I said, you'll notice that these are a lot of different thoughts, proverbs, maxims, exhortations that he's using to ultimately encourage us to avoid a foolish lifestyle, to be encouraged to seek after wisdom. And so the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to start, we'll start in verse 1 here, but I'm going to list basically 7 things that I think that we will learn from Solomon here in chapter 10 about folly or about foolishness. And once again, whenever I use the word folly, I'm saying the same thing about foolishness, right? They're synonymous. So the first thing that I think we see in verse 1 is folly disgraces a wise man's honor. Once again, I'll read it. It says, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment and cause it to give off a foul odor. So does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. So what this is, once again, it's going to be talking about the effects that folly will have even in a wise or seemingly wise and honorable individual. And so what he does here is he uses a comparison of something that we could probably really visualize and maybe almost even smell, right? He's describing how there's a dead fly or dead flies, their carcasses are in this very sweet ointment of a perfumer. So if you can think of some really nice perfume or cologne, right? But then it's allowed flies to invade it, stay there, and then now they have died and begin to rot in the ointment, right? So he's saying that is exactly what wisdom with a little bit of folly is like in your life, right? So many of us probably like cologne or like perfume or like deodorant or things like that or lotion or whatever we use, right, to make ourselves look good or to smell good. However, I'm sure many of us, if we got to the point where there were many dead flies that had been rotting in it to the point where it's now sour and smelling horrible, we probably wouldn't be wanting to put that on ourselves, would we? We'd probably be kind of, gross, repulsed by it, right? Or I'm sure how many of you have ever got a drink or got a nice plate of food before, and then all of a sudden as you get to wherever you're going to sit, you notice there's a dead fly in your drink, right? Or there's ants in your food. You get to that point, and all of a sudden, it's most of the time, maybe not always, or at least for me, a lot of the time it gets so bad that I'm just like, I'm not even going to drink it. I'm not even going to eat the food now. I'm just going to go get another one, right? It literally makes it to the point where even though it's just one small little thing, it can literally affect the whole body, right? The whole meal or the whole drink or item here, even things that would be valuable or precious to most of us. And so what he's getting at then is he's saying that you could be someone who is pretty wise and maybe has a lot of honor in your community or your respected circles, but if you have moments where you express foolishness or demonstrate folly in your life, that can actually really affect the way that other people are going to look at you. And maybe you probably know someone like that. Maybe there's someone that you really, really respected in your life one time, right? Maybe you looked up to them and you thought, wow, they're really smart, they're really wise, but then they did something, and all of a sudden it completely transformed the way that you thought about them, right? I'm not saying that this is even fair, necessarily, right? Because everyone makes mistakes, we're not perfect, but it's true that there are times when people will make one really big mistake in their life, and literally it can make a huge difference in the way that we think about those individuals. Or think about, famous people, right? There are people that we know that were super famous for sports or for entertainment or in government, and they said one wrong thing or they did one wrong thing, and now we don't ever hear about them again, right? So I think what the point that it's making here is that we don't want to think of, oh, I was just a little foolish this one time, as it's not that big of a deal. What we want to see is, no, a little bit of foolishness can actually have severe impact in your life. It can really make a difference, and actually it can make other people look at you and think about you differently. So that's the first thing that we see here. And actually, he kind of makes the same thought process, if you notice, in verse 18, right above chapter 10. Because he says, wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. So it's kind of a similar thought process there as well, is that, if you have a good collective body of people that are working together, like in a church or a business or in a sports team, but you have one person that starts being really foolish, you notice how bad it can affect the group, right? Think about a sporting, right? If you have a quarterback calling a play, right? And let's say the quarterback calls the right play and the team does everything they're supposed to do, but you have the one person that the ball is supposed to go to, and they decided they weren't going to listen to the play, right? That one player can make a huge difference. Or if the quarterback decided to call an audible and didn't tell anybody, right? Or if a lineman decided, I'm not going to block this play. Just one person could make a huge difference of what happens, right? And so he's saying that foolishness, either for an individual or for a community, can actually have some detrimental consequences to it. So moving forward then to verses 2 and 3, I think the next thing that we see is not only does folly disgrace an individual's honor, and it can impact those around them, I think we also see that folly can't be hidden. It says, a wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. So what we're seeing here is that fools don't fool anyone, I think is what we're seeing here. That if you're a fool, you might think that you're getting away with some of the things you're doing or saying, and maybe you might fool another fool, right? But ultimately, the general population and public, you can usually figure out who the fools are in the group, right? You can usually tell when someone is acting or speaking foolishly. And I think that's kind of what he's starting to draw out from this section. So the first thing that he does here is he talks about a wise man's heart being to the right hand and a fool's heart is to the left hand. Now, this is going to offend maybe some of the lefties in the congregation, myself included. Typically, in the ancient world, there was a precedent that when you would refer to the right hand or to the right side, that would be the right way to live. That would be power, that would be authority, that would be blessing or righteousness. Typically, when they would utilize the right hand, that's what they're referring to. And so, when you would say the left hand or the left side, it's saying that you're going the wrong direction. And so, what he's saying here essentially is that a fool is going to the left in their life. So they're going the wrong direction in their life. And so this is one of the reasons why many people can pretty much, target who the fool is, right? Because they're going the wrong direction. And I was thinking of an example of this. There was one time I used to work in Carbondale, and this is before I was working full-time here at the church, and I was coming home one evening from Carbondale, and as I'm going, obviously we go this way on the far side of 13. Well, there happened to be an elderly gentleman in his car that was on my side, which is, you notice, they should be way over here, but he was with us, and he was going that direction, right? And so all of us had to immediately stop, go very slow around him as he's slowly trying to figure out how to get out of where he is driving. See, the thing is, he didn't have to really say, hey, I'm going the wrong way. He didn't have to put a lot of signs up. It was pretty apparent he was going the wrong way because a lot of us were going this way and he was going the wrong way. And I think that's kind of why what we see after it says that the wise has his heart to the right hand and a fool heart to the left. And then verse 3, what it says is, and a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. See, he's not necessarily, like I said, having to broadcast it. A fool doesn't have to tell you that he's a fool or even say that he's wise. Rather, he shows it to us, right? Just like the individual that was going the wrong direction, you can just see it whenever these people are saying and doing certain things. And he's actually going to start giving us more examples of how you identify the fool or how you identify foolish activity. So he's saying basically, once again, it cannot be hidden. It's going to be obvious, and they're going the wrong direction. So the next thing that we'll see in verses 4 to 7 is, now we've already heard folly disgraces a wise man's honor. Folly promotes or can't be hidden. And now what we're going to see is folly promotes chaos and instability. Verses 4 to 7. It says, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your post, for conciliation pacifies great offenses. There is an evil I have seen under the sun, as an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. So here what we're seeing is it's starting to describe what happens if you have foolish people in high positions of power. And so the text uses like rulers. And I think that there's some translations that will lean towards more like a governing authority ruler, like a king or something like that, or a governor, where others I've seen take the translation more so like your boss. So you could almost think of it in like a more authoritative role, or even in a more practical way. I think that you can kind of think of these in both spheres of your life. But what it starts to describe is when you have an individual who is your ruler, and he's foolish, and he is someone that gets angry with you, right? It says in the text, it says, if the spirit of the ruler rises against you, so they get mad at you for something, right? Something probably silly. How are you to respond to that? And so what he encourages here is he says that you should have a calm and quiet response, and this is the best way to combat a fool's wrath. See, what we're going to see here is that it's literally going to want to draw you into the fool's activity, right? If someone gets really mean or angry or starts screaming at you, what do you typically want to do back to them? The exact same thing, right? Because you're angry, right? You're upset that they're calling you names or they're mistreating you, and especially if you're in the right? And so what we're seeing is that a fool in power wants to create that chaos, right? Whether intentionally or unintentionally. But what Solomon is teaching here is don't allow the fool to bring you in to his foolish lifestyle. Rather, what he calls you to do is actually try to do the opposite. Try to have a calm and a quiet response. And in fact, what that usually will do is it will subside the foolish person's wrath. It will actually calm them down. And a lot of times, it will actually eliminate the issue altogether. And I think that we can see that there are some biblical examples in the New Testament as well that kind of give us a similar thought process of dealing with those individuals that whenever they are in leadership or whenever they are foolish people and they're causing chaos or instability, how we are to respond. We see in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 15 as well as 21, and it says, "Therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him, for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good to you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps." So if you notice what it says is, when you have these individuals, these governing authorities, the king, governors, and when they're doing these things, it actually says to be submissive, to respect the governing authorities, and it actually says because what it does is it put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. So it actually is combating foolishness whenever we show a spirit of Christ, because it says our example is how Christ was a respecter of those who were in authority. He would submit himself, and he would give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And we've talked about this earlier in the book, but he basically gives us this command to have the Spirit of Christ when it comes to those individuals that are foolish and that may still have prominent positions above us. Likewise, in Matthew 5:9, it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." And I think that this is something that we should aspire for, generally speaking, right? When you have a boss who's maybe a little bit of a jerk or a hothead, or if you have governing authorities that, they're not very wise in the way that they live their lives, we still ultimately are hoping to live a peaceable life. We're trying to keep our demeanor, keep our wisdom, and not allow us to fall into the foolish activity, right? We don't want to share in their folly. So I think that that's the encouragement that he's giving us here. But then I think it's also important that we recognize that that doesn't mean that there aren't times where we can't do what it's saying here, because it says that it doesn't want you to flee this authority. It doesn't want you to oppose the authority, right? But I think that it's important that we do recognize that there are moments that we do confront tyranny. There are times that we are to engage in a fight, but we see in chapter 8, verse 3 of the same book that he does give us a caution with it. He says, do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. So if we're going to do or go against an authority figure, and if we see that their foolishness or their tyranny is too much, like especially if they're calling us to disobey or disavow God or his commandments, well then at that moment we have to disobey. But we always want to do it with grace and with caution, because we never want to just be roped into another evil or another foolish thing. So I think Solomon gives us both spheres here of having a calm and quiet response. We'll also recognize that there may be biblical exceptions depending on the severity of the situation. But then from there, as we're talking about these rulers who get angry with their subjects or their servants, and how we are called to respond in a wise way, we also see then how when you have these individuals that are sitting on the throne, when you have folly and authority, you'll also notice that everything starts to get topsy-turvy, right? When you have those individuals who are at the top and they're foolish people, you'll start to see that a lot of crazy things start to happen. And so the example that he gives here is he says you have princes who are basically walking along the side of the road, right? They don't have horses, and they're basically doing the manual labor of the city. And then you have these servants who are uneducated and aren't doing very well, and basically they're the fools here, I think, in the text, and they're riding the horses, a place of prominence, and they're getting the high position. So what we're seeing actually is fools promoting fools. And I think you'll notice that probably happens a lot in job space, in schools, in government, right? Fools like to promote other fools, don't they? And by the way, I don't think what this is teaching here when it says that servants are on the horse and the princes are on the ground, I don't think it's teaching what Jesus was talking about with justice being served in the end, where the first will be last and the last will be first. I think Solomon is teaching this is a negative thing in this text. He's saying that what's happening here is because of folly, not because of wisdom here. So he's explaining once again that when you have these individuals in power and they're foolish, they're going to promote the chaos, the instability, and you're going to have people serving in capacities where they're not qualified for, and all it's going to do is basically cause more and more problems for the community and for themselves. So we see folly disgraces the wise man's honor. It promotes chaos and instability. It cannot be hidden. And in verses 8 to 11, as we move forward, we're going to see that folly can also be dangerous. Folly can be dangerous. It says, "He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. If the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength. But wisdom brings success. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different." So what we're seeing here is that he starts to describe a lot of daily life activities. And what we start to see is that life is dangerous. We live in a dangerous world where accidents happen, where bad things happen. And what he's going to show here is that if you are not functioning or exercising wisdom in your day-to-day activities, it's also going to make sure that these dangerous things become more and more likely for you. And so what we see here, I think, is 4 proverbs given that set forth the potential dangers that represent these daily tasks. And so what we see here is 1, digging a pit, tearing down a wall, quarrying stones, and splitting logs. So the first one, it says, if you dig a pit, you will fall into it. And I want to just grab the other one too. And it says, and whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. Now, some take this to not necessarily be describing a daily activity as maybe the other two, or some think that maybe this is a little bit more nefarious, that these actually might be individuals that are doing bad things, that they're not just doing their job and not being wise about it, but they're actually doing some things that they shouldn't be doing. And so some take this to be they're digging a pit in the sense they're trying to set up a trap. Right? You're trying to, there's an example of where they were trying to get David to fall into a pit. And so they were setting a trap for him. So what it might be discussing is that if you're someone that tries to set a trap for other people, you're going to end up falling into the trap that you set. Or another way is if you're breaking down a wall, and this could be potentially trying to break into someone's home or into a place that you shouldn't be, because walls are usually meant to separate things. If you're breaking into a wall, you could not be aware of what's on the other side. right? If you ever had someone that broke into someone's house and they were a Second Amendment person, right? You break into a house and they're a Second Amendment person, you might not be liking what comes on the other side. There might be a snake ready to bite you, right? So it could be that warning there that it's saying that if you do bad things, you can expect bad consequences to fall upon you. But if you don't take it that way and you just say, no, this is describing day-to-day things, I think it also could be helpful for us then as we think about our day-to-day work. So if you're digging a pit, right, if you're making a hole in the ground, make sure that you're aware of what the serious consequences would be if you're not paying attention, right? So if you've ever done something like that, if you work for a tree company or power lines, think about what the bad things could happen if you don't pay attention, right? That could be a pretty self-explanatory way to think about it. Or the other two examples that we had here was quarrying stones, which would be like cutting and distributing and moving stones and splitting logs, or like cutting down trees. Who has ever seen or heard of someone that decided, you know what, I have a chainsaw in my garage and that tree needs to be cut down? Who has heard of a story or seen a video of someone that decided to take it into their own hands? They don't have any experience, don't have any training, and they go ahead, cut the tree, and then the tree, what does it do? It crashes on the house, the car, something else, right? Themselves, right? And I think what this is saying here, once again, is if you are doing these things and you're not being wise about them, then you could end up harming yourself by splitting the wood, right? You could end up hurting yourself. So once again, it's important that we recognize that life is dangerous, but folly is even more dangerous here. And then from there, what we then see is we see then that there's a couple other stories or comparisons that we get, and it talks about having an axe and cutting trees. So if you just think about, we just talked about splitting wood in general, then it talks about an axe being dull, right? And basically saying that if you have an axe that is dull and you're trying to cut down trees or cut wood, you have to use a lot more strength with it, right? You have to work a lot harder with it. And so what it's encouraging us to do, obviously, is to make sure that our axes are sharp, right? Because if basically it's, work smarter, not harder. There's a story of two lumberjacks, maybe you have heard of it before, where these two lumberjacks, they work together side by side every single day, and they've worked together, and at noon every single day, one of the lumberjacks leaves for an hour. And then he comes back, and the other one just continues to work all day, continues to cut wood. And every single day, every single week, every single month, and at the end of the year, the one lumberjack that would always stop working for an hour would always end up being more productive and more effective than the other lumberjack that kept working. And so finally, at the end of the year, he asks this other lumberjack, he says, where do you go? Why do you always take off an hour every single day? And he says, I go to sharpen my axe. See, the guy was working more hours than the guy that was, that was going to sharpen it. But the thing is, he was preparing so that he could be more effective. And so I think what we're seeing here is likewise with wisdom, that there are times that we have to take time to prepare. We have to utilize and prepare for things so that we will be more effective on the things that we'll go through. And so I think we see here a call to prepare. But then we also see in the very next verse, I think, the reverse of that. So there are going to be times where we need to take time to prepare, and I think there are going to be other times where we need to act before it is too late. And so what it describes here, after it talks about the axe and it being dull, we see a serpent biting a snake charmer. See, I think that's what you see here. What would happen if you had a snake charmer who was sitting by a snake and is like, I'm going to just take my time with you, and I'm going to wait to charm you. I'm going to hang out with you for a little bit. What's going to happen? You're going to get bit by the snake, the serpent, right? But if a charmer does and executes the gifts that they have, the things that they've already acquired, and if they charm the snake first, then they'll do well to not be bit. So what we see here, I think, is two sides of wisdom here. We see that there are times where we need to take more time to prepare, and there's other times where we need to act before it is too late. And I think wisdom is knowing the difference. Wisdom is knowing where one instance requires one tact and one instance requires another here. And so I think we see then this call for wisdom here. And I just want to jump back to the New Testament for a moment just to give us some assurance once again. So where does our wisdom come from as Christians? Day to day, when it comes to our spiritual life, when it comes to our choices and everything we do, I think we need to remember that our wisdom comes from hearing the words of Christ and obeying them. In Matthew 7:24, it says, "Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock." Likewise, in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, it says, "But you must continue in the things which you have learned and been assured of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the holy scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus." So once again, a reminder that if we want to be truly wise and effective in all of these things we've already discussed, we want to trust in Christ. We want to look to Christ, hear his words, and obey them, actually apply them to our lives. And that is where true safety becomes, not just physical safety, but also our eternal security with Christ. So we see that folly can be dangerous here in verses 8 to 11. In verses 12 to 14, I think what we see here is that folly always likes to multiply words. It likes to multiply or increase words. It says, "The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him?" So at first it tells us what a wise individual, how they speak. And what we see here is that a wise individual chooses their words carefully. When they decide to speak, it actually matters. It has weight. They've thought it through before just sharing the first thought or concept or words that came, to their mind, right? So I think that this is the call for us as believers, that when we speak with wisdom. And in Luke 4:22, we see the example of Christ once again. It says, "So all bore witness to him," that is Jesus, "and marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, 'Is this not Joseph's son?'" See, when Jesus spoke, it mattered. His words carried with it weight. And I actually believe that Jesus probably never wasted a word. Every single time that he spoke, I think that it actually had significance, that he always carried himself and spoke with wisdom. And so I wonder how many of us are doing that day to day. Are we wasting so many words that we regularly spew out of our mouths that really are actually foolishness? Because once again, as we look here, it says that the foolish people are the ones that they like to talk a lot. And the examples that they give here, not only does it say that they multiply words, but it says that they make extravagant claims about what they know and about what they will do, but they're unable to back them up. Have you ever found an individual that they just feel like they know so much, or they know exactly what's going to happen in the future, and they start saying like, "This is going to happen, I know this is going to happen," and you start to say, "How do you know this?" And they're like, "Oh, I don't have any examples or reasons to back this up." So you're just saying something you think. Is that a question? Okay. So we have people that will say things like that, and they'll say they know the future, that they can predict it exactly. But as we've read already in the text, that there's so many uncertainties in life that we can't ever say for sure that this is going to happen, or that we obviously we know that the Lord is in control of these things, that he is the one that will decide what will and will not occur. So we have those individuals that they think they know everything, but also things that they say that they will do. Have you ever had someone that they always have these big plans, and they're going to get rich by doing this, or they have all of the the little schemes in life, and they're always just saying these things, and you're just like, yeah, once again, I've heard you say this before. You're not gonna follow through with it. There's no reason for me to have any confidence that you're gonna succeed in what you do. They just continue to spew out all of this nonsense. I think that's what we're seeing here, that folly multiplies words. In verse 15, I think we see that folly compromises our work. I've kind of already mentioned a little bit about day-to-day work, but I think you see this once again about this concept of working smarter and not harder. It says, "The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city." Have you ever had someone that's been working on the job and they just seem like they have no clue what they're doing? Or they just seem to always make the job that much harder? And an example I've thought about before is like if you've ever had there's a lot of materials that are heavy right here, and they need to all be taken and thrown away in the trash can. And so what they do is they start to take one little heavy item, walk all the way over there and put it in the empty trash can, and they keep doing it rather than getting the empty trash can and taking it to all the heavy materials and then putting it in. See, that's the difference here. And I think what it's saying is you have individuals like that basically, they make their job so much harder, and then they end up being more tired and weary because of the fact that they're being foolish and not being wise with the way that they are even doing their labor or their work. And it even says that sometimes they even get lost in this text. It says that they don't even know how to go to the city. So there's some thoughts that maybe this is an expression that they use, kind of like they don't know when to be in or out whenever it's raining or something like that. So you have a concept of them, they're just kind of lost. They just really don't know what they're doing on the job. So we see that folly can compromise your work. And then the final section in verses 16 to 20, I think what we see here is that folly can corrupt a nation. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. Blessed are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobles and your princes feast at the proper time. For strength and not for drunkenness, because of laziness the buildings decay, and through the idleness of hands the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Do not curse the king, even in your thought. Do not curse the rich, even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell that matter. So here I think what we're seeing is it starts to describe these individuals. Once again, you have some that are kings, right, or that are in these high authority or positions once again. And it describes one king as being a child. The king is a child, and then those who are blessed are those who have a king that is the son of nobles, right? And so what it starts to explain is you'll have certain individuals that are foolish and that are in leadership, and what it can actually do is it can really affect the entire nation. It can really breed more foolishness and more corruption, more decay. And so one of the examples they give is it has these foolish leaders that are feasting in the morning. Now, I don't think this is against having a hearty breakfast every now and then, right? I don't think it's saying don't have breakfast. I think what this is describing is you have these kings, these leaders, that what they do is they wake up every morning, and rather than prioritizing work or the kingdom or ensuring that they are accruing more resources for themselves and for their people, they're basically saying, let's get drunk, let's eat a lot, and let's relax today because we don't need to, we'll put work off later. And it's saying the opposite of that is what's wise. No, you get up, you prioritize hard work and labor and taking care of your priorities, and then you can have a nice meal in the evening for strength, right? So that's, I think, what it's saying. It's kind of showing us that foolish people feast when kingdom work should be prioritized. And I think as Christians, once again, we need to make sure that we are prioritizing work over feasting, and that we have wisdom to know when it's time to feast and when it's time to work, once again. So I think we see that being there. And then it talks about money for a moment in verse 19. It says, money answers everything. Now, I think that he's using a little bit of hyperbole. I don't think he says money can save your soul for salvation. I don't think money gives you, infinite wisdom. I think what he's saying in context of what we just talked about, if you have those who are working and using wisdom and are prioritizing the right things for the kingdom, what we'll see is that though a feast can make you laugh and wine can make you merry, what money can do is it actually can make all of these things multiply, and it will actually deal with a lot more problems. It will actually solve a lot of more things for you, because if all you do is dwell on, I want the food, I want the wine, and that's all you dwell on, yeah, it'll make you happy for a moment, but ultimately if you want to have money that will sustain these things for your food, for your lodging, for protection, you want to make sure that you prioritize that work once again. And so finally, though, in the last section, what we see here is that though we see how foolish people can run the nation, can be in these positions of power, how they might not always do the best that's going to bring production or efficiency in, he still warns us not to curse or gossip about those individuals. Because that can be so tempting for us, because we can see how there are governing authorities who do this, right? They rule foolishly. They don't prioritize the economy or their people. They care more about their bellies. They like to feast and not work, right? I'm sure a lot of us can relate to that. But in those moments, he's still once again saying that we are not to curse them or to gossip about them. And it says because if you do that, it actually can end up working to your bad. So not only is it unwise to do, but also it says that a little birdie could hear you and could go and tell somebody, and maybe that's happened to you before, maybe in the church or at your job or at your school or in your family unit. You say one thing about that one person and you thought that nobody else was listening, and somebody was listening, right? So think about what you're saying. Once again, use wisdom with your words because it might affect you and actually might come to bite you, later. So it's important that we use wisdom here. And I want to just read a few more verses on this same thought and then we'll close. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 to 2 says, "Therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence." So once again, don't gossip about them, don't make fun of them, don't curse them, pray for them. How many of us have talked bad about governing authorities? How many of us have prayed for them? That's our goal, is we want to pray for them. In James 1:5, which I read just a couple of weeks ago, if any of you lacks wisdom, so if you lack wisdom for any of these things we've talked about, especially when it comes to praying for our leaders, it says, "Let him ask of God who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him." So let us ask God for wisdom in any of these areas. Hopefully you're being convicted a little bit and saying, I am a little foolish in this area. I have been doing things that are not very wise in this area. And hopefully we're seeing these things and recognize God can give us wisdom. And that godly wisdom will inform us to live the good life that Solomon's been leading us to. And ultimately it's going to remind us that our true hope and our true fulfillment is going to come from him and from him alone.